It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Jeremy Cherfas is a biologist and communicator. He was a senior writer at Bioversity International, where he was responsible for many papers and publications stressing the role of agricultural and dietary diversity in promoting resilience and better nutrition. Before moving to Rome in 2001, he ran a small seed company and campaigned against the European Community's Common Catalogue. Since 2013, he has produced Eat This podcast, which uses food to examine everything from agriculture to zoology. The title of Jeremy's talk today is What is Wrong with Biofortification?, in which he presents views on ongoing progress to biofortify starchy staple crops. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Yanni, and thank you very much to the Crop Trust for organizing this webinar, and thank you to everybody in your different time zones for being here today. Let me just echo what Yanni said about questions. There'll be time for questions afterwards, and put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So, yeah, my talk. What is wrong with biofortification? I'm going to share my screen now. And what I really want to say is that this is not a question. I'm not asking what's wrong with biofortification. My co-author and I, Martin van Ginkel, a breeder who many of you may know, we think there's plenty wrong with biofortification. And the reason that we together wrote this paper was to draw attention to some of these issues. Like I say, it's not a question. And my plan in this webinar is to go through some of the points that we make in our paper. Another point I need to make is that generally we're talking about genetic biofortification of staple crops, that is, breeding staple crops to contain higher amounts of vitamins and minerals, micronutrients. We're not talking about agronomic fortification, where you might spray the plant or add minerals to the soil, and we're not talking about food fortification, where you would add micronutrients to a prepared foodstuff. And this paper, the paper itself, gives some of the history and background to the problem of hidden hunger, which is this missing micronutrients. It's called hidden hunger because the effects are not obvious to the naked eye. They may be long-term. They often include things like stunting overall, or they may include cognitive deficiencies. There are a lot of issues with hidden hunger. It is by no means a solved problem. In fact, globally, the latest estimates in the Lancet are that 1 in 2 children and 2 in 3 women suffer at least one micronutrient deficiency. And why do I say only children and women? Because there aren't data for other demographic groups, and that's yet another problem with hidden hunger in general. So, okay, there are 4 things, 4 general headings that I want to come on and discuss. One is the yield penalty. By biofortifying a staple crop, you may be reducing the total yield. Another is genetic uniformity. The kinds of constructs that are used to biofortify staple crops are generally the same construct is used in many, many different efforts to biofortify, and that is a difficulty. Next is the suitability of biofortified staples for poorer subsistence, small-scale farmers. I think we all in the back of our minds now have the idea that the Green Revolution was pretty good for farmers who were already doing all right on reasonably good land, but it didn't really do an awful lot for poorer subsistence, small-scale farmers. And then finally, the question of evidence. The whole point of biofortifying staples is to improve nutritional status, especially micronutrient status, but in fact, there's very little evidence that that is the case. Excuse me. So, okay, yield penalty. There are three basic ideas here that I want to talk about. One is the question of dilution, that by increasing micronutrients, you may be reducing overall yield. The other is that the varieties, the check varieties against which new biofortified varieties are compared, are often way out of date. And the third is the kind of consequences of the yield penalties. So let me now stop screen sharing so that I can talk to you more directly. There is, I'll probably say this more often, there is much more on this in the paper itself, and I'm not going to go into huge details here. But the first concern is a kind of dilution. The higher the yield, the lower the concentration of micronutrients. And if you think about it, that's not really that surprising. If you imagine that the plant is capable of taking up and synthesizing a given quantity of minerals and taking up minerals and synthesizing micronutrients, then it's kind of obvious that if you increase the yield, you might decrease the concentration of those micronutrients and minerals. And there is evidence to that effect. There's evidence that higher micronutrients are correlated with lower overall yield for zinc. If you look at rice, for beta carotene, if you look at cassava or maize or sweet potato, there is a negative correlation between mineral content and yield in wheat. And the reasons for that differ between micronutrients and species, but quite often it's actually a direct competition between different metabolic pathways. So for example, in sweet potato, the metabolic pathway for beta carotene and the metabolic pathway for starch synthesis are both competing for the raw materials they need to complete their pathways. So again, if you've juiced up the synthetic pathway for beta carotene, you're going to reduce the amount available to be making starch. And this is something that Martin van Ginkel in particular has looked at, and there are lots of examples in the paper. And then the next problem with yield is the problem of outdated check varieties. Now, check varieties, for those of you who are not involved in breeding or in the certification of newly released varieties, a variety in general, in the formal system, a variety has to prove its use. It has to prove its value for cultivation and use. And the way that's done is on-farm trials usually of the new variety against accepted standardized test varieties. And these are ones that are known to do well. And the new variety has to do better than those if it's going to be recommended for adoption. The problem that we've isolated is that the check varieties are often at least 10 years out of date from modern varieties. And if you take a very average rate of increase of yield of somewhere between 0.5% and 1% per year, which is a long-term average, been declining recently, but that's a completely separate problem. If you take that kind of normal rate of increase, then the best modern unbiofortified variety is liable to be somewhere between 5% and 10% better after 10 years. So if you're going to compare a biofortified variety with the Czech variety, you want it to be at least 5 to 10% better than the Czech variety. Well, the problem is that in general, there is a yield penalty. It varies for rice and wheat. It's between 20 and 30%. So the yield of the biofortified varieties is about 20% to 30%. Same is true for cassava and maize. It's between 20% and 30% lower than the Czech varieties. But if you take into account the fact that the Czech varieties, that the most modern varieties are producing around 5 to 10% more than the Czech varieties, well, then the yield penalty is actually much greater. It's around 30 or maybe even 40%. And for one of the poster children of biofortification, orange flesh sweet potatoes, the result is even worse, because the yield of modern OFSP, orange flesh sweet potato, is around 75% of the Czech variety. But the Czech variety was released in 1989, so 35 years ago, with the same average increase of between 0.5% and 1% per year. The yield penalty is probably around 50%. In other words, by growing an orange fleshed sweet potato instead of your normal standard approved sweet potato, you might be only getting half as much yield. So the question really is, do farmers realize that? Will they be told by the promoters of biofortified varieties? Or might they adopt a biofortified variety and then discover that the yield is lower, 30% lower, 40% lower, 50% lower? And so now, in addition to them having a micronutrient deficiency, hidden hunger, they may well have a macronutrient deficiency, actual hunger for calories and protein. Now, I find that I don't see that discussed or we haven't seen that discussed anywhere. And it does seem that by claiming that biofortification will improve global food quality, it might actually be jeopardizing global food quantity, especially if it's very widely adopted, which fortunately so far it hasn't been. So next up, genetic uniformity. These happen to be the Dion twins, 5 identical sisters born in Canada in the 30s. And the point about genetic uniformity, I think, is pretty well understood. But what's the problem with biofortification? Well, biofortification contributes to genetic uniformity because the technology used involves backcrossing repeatedly into the same well-adapted parent strains, and very often using the same genetic packages to insert high micronutrient levels into multiple new varieties. And that's true whether you're using conventional breeding technologies or direct DNA manipulation. You can insert the construct in different ways, but you're always going to want to be backcrossing in order to regain the performance of the parent varieties. And for reasons mostly of economy and efficiency, the same micronutrient gene constructs tend to get used over and over again. A laboratory is not going to ring the changes on constructs if they've got a protocol that works with one construct and a given species. They're not going to just change the constructs because they ought to. They tend to be focused much more on efficiency and using a construct that they know will work. And it's even more worrying now, because when you read some of the promoting of biofortification. There's talk about mainstreaming biofortification into all breeding programs, and where the idea would be to use marker-assisted selection to early on in the process identify those lines that have got the construct you want, and then focus on those. So again, in the name of efficiency, the widespread adoption of marker-assisted selection and high micronutrient constructs could very easily lead to the much wider presence of just a few constructs. And we've already seen this beginning to happen for beta carotene. In cereals, there are actually many alleles that will increase the amount of beta carotene in the seed. But the focus of biofortification efforts has been on very few of those constructs, usually the ones that work best. And we do have good examples from the past of the dangers of genetic uniformity. I mean, the one I've highlighted here is Texas male sterility. This was a cytoplasmic construct that was used in the 1970s to make it easier to breed hybrid corn, hybrid maize. It prevented the plant from producing pollen. That meant that loads of American teenagers lost their summer jobs detasseling corn, but it made things much more efficient for the plant breeders. And the result was an outbreak of southern corn blight, which in some counties in the US, Corn Belt actually devastated the crop to the extent of losing the entire crop. And on average, half the crop was lost. And it was unpredictable because it was a pleiotropic effect of this Texas male sterility that made plants with it susceptible to southern corn blight. And as soon as it was realized that no longer was used in breeding F1 hybrid corn, but it's a warning. It's a warning. We have no idea what might happen if specific constructs for higher micronutrients, if they become widespread. We simply don't know what will happen. And we don't know whether the solution will be as simple as not using those constructs in future. And people have said, oh, well, we now have plant protection. We can spray crops with southern corn against corn blight and various other fungal diseases. We can spray them with fungicides. Again, I would say that's not the answer, especially not for small subsistence farmers. And that brings me on to the next of our issues, which is the suitability of biofortified foods for the intended audience, which is always said to be small subsistence farmers. It's always said to be aimed at sustainability. And those are really big claims that I really think ought to be addressed. I mean, primarily the question I would say is, do small subsistence farmers appreciate the benefits, if there are any? I've already mentioned the issue of yield penalty. And this goes beyond simply education. For example, in orange-fleshed sweet potato rollouts, there's been a lot of emphasis on education about the value of orange-fleshed sweet potato. And most of the follow-up data suggests that education didn't really make much difference either to adoption or to micronutrient status. So, okay, who then benefits from rollouts of these crops. And another problem, I think, which is even more disconcerting, with orange flesh sweet potato, you have, and indeed with beta carotene crops in general, maize, cassava, banana even, you have a visible indicator that the micronutrient is present in higher quantities. You have the orange color. And for orange flesh sweet potato, for cassava, you can select propagating material that has the orange color. For maize and other seed-borne crops, you can presumably select for darker colored kernels. But with minerals, in particular iron and zinc, the higher concentration will be invisible. So if farmers are saving their own seeds, and if there is some cross-pollination, which we would expect, at least a certain level, how are they going to maintain their varieties so that they continue to deliver higher levels of micronutrients? I don't know the answer to that. I don't see that addressed in any of the promotion that I've seen for high mineral varieties. And going beyond that, so farmers won't be able to tell that they have farmers won't be able to select specific seeds that are high mineral content. But what about shoppers in the market? Let's say your education program is a grand success and everybody is in the market looking for high iron rice or high zinc wheat or whatever it may be. I think we know enough about how the marketplace works, especially the informal marketplace, to know that if there's a premium for selling a crop because it is believed to convey some benefit, there are going to be traders who are perfectly willing to charge the premium without delivering the benefit. And again, I've seen no discussion of that. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, the yield penalty. How will the macronutrients be made up? What happens if the farmer, as a result of the yield penalty, actually has less surplus to sell? And I can see a gender aspect to this, because often men farmers are more interested in staples and cash crops for selling the surplus. How are they going to react if they have less surplus to sell? I think that's another reason for being somewhat dubious about the suitability for smaller farmers. And again, I think the Green Revolution should ring some alarm bells for us on this. So moving on, the question of evidence. And this, I think, really is the weakest link in the whole story. I did I won't call this a meta-analysis by any means, but I did a quick and dirty search in PubMed for any paper that mentioned the keywords biofortification and impact. And it's surprising how few of them there are. I mean, maybe I should do a formal meta-analysis, but I'm not likely to. It's surprising how few papers there are that measure nutrient status in a target population before and after an intervention involving biofortified foods. Furthermore, there's actually very little evidence of changes in either nutrient status or behavior. The claim keeps being repeated that biofortified foods result in improved nutrient status and behavior, but there really is not very good support. I mean, yes, it's true, orange flesh sweet potatoes can improve serum retinol. That's approximate marker of vitamin A deficiency. But Does it actually have an impact on vitamin A status? Does it reduce xerophthalmia in the worst cases? We really don't know. Likewise, high iron millet. Let me stop this sharing. High iron millet. It can be shown that children who eat high iron millet show a little improvement in their light physical activity at school. But there's no increase in their more vigorous activity. So are they really healthier? Very hard to say, very hard to say. And if you look in detail at most of the papers, they very often report no difference in behavioral outcomes or nutritional status. Very often the differences are statistically insignificant, and yet those papers go on to say that biofortification is the solution to hidden hunger and must be promoted. And there's a little bit of sort of clever wordification that goes on where you shift from an argument that says a priori, from first principles, having more nutrients in a staple crop ought to be able to increase nutrient status. It can increase nutrient status. And then they jump to saying, well, it does increase nutrient status, but there's actually very, very little evidence that it does. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect more evidence and better evidence. And there's actually a long history of this, almost from the start of efforts to biofortify staple foods. A 2002 paper evaluating the impact of biofortification on human nutrition said, look, we have to have a three-step approach. We have to measure bioavailability. We have to have comprehensive feeding trials in a community. And in almost all projects that I've seen, those three factors didn't happen: bioavailability, feeding trials, and trials in the community. It didn't happen. In 2007, Harvest Plus itself reviewed the challenges faced by nutritionists to do with biofortified foods. It identified those challenges, but they didn't do much about it in their subsequent projects. And as recently as 2002, there was a critical review of indicators, metrics, and methods, and they identified 17 high-level indicators for the success, the impact of biofortification, and only one of those was about nutrition. And it's labeled micronutrient intake. There's nothing to do with overall health of the individual or their micronutrient status, only the intake of micronutrients, which, as I said earlier, a priori, yes, if you eat more micronutrients, your status should go up, but there are all kinds of reasons why it doesn't. Okay. I guess having gone through what we see as some of the problems with biofortification as it's been carried out, I want to backtrack a bit and say, well, okay, so what? Well, the big so what is that biofortification absorbed a lot of funding. I mean, we reckon about $500 million over the past 20 years or so. That's an underestimate, probably. And partly as a result of that, very little went into the study of alternatives like dietary diversity. Very little went into other promising activities and avenues. Simple example, in Southeast Asia, there have been efforts to use small indigenous fish species to make chutneys and dried fish powder that can massively increase micronutrient value of ordinary meals based on staples. They work, they've been shown to work, and yet they're not that widely adopted, and they're not seen as a solution that could be used elsewhere. African leafy vegetables, I mean, okay, mea culpa, Bioversity International, IPCRI before it, has long had a focus on African leafy vegetables. They proved useful, but they never really got the nutritional follow-up that they required, and they never really got widely taken up. We know that dietary diversity protects wealthy people against non-communicable diseases like heart disease and other correlates with obesity, but we don't really know whether that's been. Well, it's been very little studied among poorer farmers whether that can protect against causes of mortality, whether diverse diets can protect against causes of mortality. It's not even clear, in many cases, it's not even clear whether biofortification was actually needed. Biofortification of staples was actually needed. There's a very interesting set of studies of high iron beans in Rwanda, for example, by a group of scientists, including some from CGIAR centers, but a group of scientists led by a Cornell professor. And if you look at that, it was assumed, and this is an assumption, there's no justification. It was assumed that the beans in the market in Rwanda were low iron with a value of 50 parts per million. But even if you go back to the start of the high iron fortification program for beans, if you look in the market, there were some varieties that had not been engineered or selected or anything like it. There were some varieties that actually had iron levels as high as 70 parts per million. And in the market, this group at Cornell compared high iron varieties with biofortified varieties, and there was no difference in the average concentration of iron. It was 71 parts per million. So if the average biofortified and non-biofortified varieties are equal, what accounts for the anemia that was so prevalent and that was the starting point for deciding to biofortified beans? Maybe it isn't the beans. Maybe there's something else going on. And actually, later work by the same group at Cornell has shown that the heritability of iron and indeed zinc is actually very low. Only 20% of the iron concentration, only 20% of the variation in iron concentration, and even less, 9% of the variation in zinc concentration is down to genetics. The rest of it is environmental, probably more to do with soils than it is to do with the variety itself. And if you look at the beans, there are some traits, a light color, yellow seed coat, and fast cooking, which are often preferred by the women who are preparing food for their families, which deliver more bioavailable iron. The mechanisms are very complex, but why not promote those instead of biofortifying a new variety, which would have with it problems of uniformity if widely adopted? Why not just promote selecting light-colored beans, at least part of the time? With iron in particular, I mentioned the little fish. There was also a very interesting program to make available a little piece of iron, a little ingot of raw iron in the shape of a fish, because they're lucky in Southeast Asia. And you pop that into the pot when you cook the beans or rice. And as a result, you get more iron in the food. That seems to have vanished as well. So in conclusion, I think the big problem with biofortification is that it's superficially extremely attractive. I mean, it's obvious. If you're missing micronutrients, minerals or vitamins, obviously, if you put more of them into the things people eat, people are going to be healthier. And then you can kind of understand how that would be really attractive to politicians, governments, grant-giving bodies, policymakers. It's a simple solution to what's actually a really difficult problem. And it's following on in a kind of history of what you could call nutritionism, which almost starts with the discovery of vitamins. And it's this idea that foods have active ingredients. It's this idea that sees diet as a medical intervention almost, that, in the West, it's almost a joke. You eat broccoli and that's going to protect you from cancer because broccoli happens to have some anti-cancer activity. And then you end up with a pill that contains extract of broccoli. It's part of nutritionism, medicalization, reductionism. And you could see it's easy to see why policymakers like that. All that talk that they hear about sustainability and scaling up, that also makes it extremely attractive. The problem is that it hasn't delivered. The evidence hasn't been found. Adoption, I will say, has been declining year on year. And in some ways, to be perfectly cynical, that's a good thing for food security. If it means that farmers don't pay the yield penalty of the biofortified varieties, then as long as they can improve their diet in other ways and maybe improve their livelihoods, that's a good thing. So it hasn't delivered, and yet it continues to attract funding, at least $500 million over the past 20 years, as I said. And donors and policymakers, they say they want evidence, but they are continuing to fund in the absence of evidence. And I believe that it has actually been an obstacle to other approaches. So let me just expand on that a little bit. What could we be doing instead of or in addition to biofortification if we wanted to? Well, first of all, I would say that I'm encouraged by the fact that despite fairly intense lobbying, the WHO has not endorsed biofortification as a procedure to address hidden hunger, micronutrient deficiency. And maybe there's been a decline in funding. Of that, I can't be absolutely sure, but it seems like funding for biofortification might be tapering off. And I'm really happy to say there seems to have been increased attention to the problems of biofortification since our paper came out. We've been cited about a dozen times already by papers arguing in many cases for a new look at alternative approaches. So that's pretty good. Dietary diversity, as I said before, it has been tried and it does work, but because diet is culturally and geographically far more constrained than staple crops, it's much more difficult to have a big solution to dietary diversity. It's really difficult to scale. Now, one way you can perhaps do that is to combine cash transfers direct cash transfers so that people have money to spend on food. And we know that having more money does lead to a slight increase in spending on food. There's no great evidence so far that cash transfers reduce the prevalence of stunting. May improve cognitive performance by enabling people to buy more diverse diets, but there really hasn't been enough study of undernourishment. And one of the problems here is that policies, it's a sort of imbalance effect, really. Policies that benefit the people who are suffering from hidden hunger, those people don't have much say in the policies. The one where they do is with cash transfers, where given education, they can describe what they want, they can change what they want to buy. But the people who promote biofortification have an outsized influence on higher level government policies. So I would like to see more cash transfers, and I would like to see that combined with locally appropriate education. But the other point that I think is important, and especially important for gene banks and breeders, is to breed staples for yield and for climate resilience, because it's a kind of a land sparing argument. If staples can give you a higher yield, you've got more land available for the fruits and vegetables that you need for a diverse and nourishing diet. And the fact is that, yes, hidden hunger is a huge problem, but so is actual macro hunger for protein and calories. And so if we can increase the yield of staples for those reasons, we will tackle hunger directly and free up land. Another thing that we could see much more of is to select for nutrition, both in processing and in actual breeding. So one quick example, bioavailability, which I've mentioned briefly, is often tied up with the way that crops are processed. And there are inhibitors, uptake inhibitors, phytates in many, many seeds. If you de-germ maize kernels before grinding them into flour or cooking with them, you actually can increase the bioavailability of iron quite considerably, 30 to 40%. It's not as simple as just saying, well, we should de-germ maize, because there are actually complex interactions with the bran color and the quality of the maize starch. But nevertheless, there needs to be a lot more study of how to actually improve nutrition by changing the way foods are processed. And another aspect of that is that biofortification, because of the high tech, because of the needs for efficiency, it does tend to focus breeding activities in silos, effectively in silos. Breeders may get their germplasm from lots of different places, but once they've got hold of them, I wonder how often they feed back their results, how often they're involved in community trials, and so on. And I think if there were wider goals to breeding for nutrition, then we might see greater collaboration. The next thing I think that would be important is generally to diversify the basket, not only of food, but also of available options. Almost all the talk in addressing micronutrients has been about increasing the supply. And I wish people would spend more attention to what the nutrition expert Will Masters, what he calls generating demand through education, through making crops available, through assistance programs like cash transfers. If people have the education and the power to say, I would like to buy these things, I would like to grow these things, maybe the response would be greater and the impact would be greater. And the final point, which I think is really, really important, I think efforts to improve nutrition really need to abandon ideas of scale. Scale has become the new godhead at which plant breeding seems to worship. One solution, globally important. We've seen what that does. We've seen what that does in the Green Revolution. It's I find it deeply frustrating that people are still talking about tools for scaling, improving scaling, upscaling, assessing readiness to scale. And I think we need to go back to basics and address communities at the scale at which they source their diets. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. Oh, I've got a thank you slide. I always forget my thank you slide. Here we go. There we go. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was wonderful presentation, very thorough on outcomes of biofortification research and breeding. And also thank you for giving us possible alternatives. We do have some questions, I think 4 of them. Excuse me, 4 of them. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to read them out and then you'll have a chance to answer them. The first one is about your yield slide. It says, the yield argument feels tricky. On the one hand, it is a tangible measure of difference, but at the same time, would the increase in nutrient structure net off the kilogram output?
Okay, that's a very astute question. And if there is no problem with calorie deficiency or protein deficiency, then I would say, yeah, okay, take it as take the yield penalty and accept the increased bioavailability of micronutrients. The problem is that land, as I said before, land is a limited resource. If you're growing the same amount of calories, you need 30% more land. 20 to 30% more land. Does everybody have 20 to 30% more land in order to meet their calorie requirements if they're growing these biofortified crops? I would just say, I think nobody's looked at it directly, but if there is a large yield penalty, then in order to make up the shortfall, you have to have more of the staple. And where does that come from?
Okay. Second question has to do with storage ability. So do biofortified varieties store better? Is there a positive correlation between the higher beta carotene maize varieties and their ability to store better, for example, in cases with insects and pests? Do you have any data or have you come across anything like that?
I have never come across anything like that. I don't know of, I've never looked specifically. So let me just say, I don't know. It's an interesting idea. I'd be very interested to find out if that is the case.
Okay, third question. Hello, Jeremy. Thank you for this rich presentation. Compared to the cultivated varieties, do the crop wild relatives taste better? And if that is the case, it's related to a higher level of nutrients? And the follow question to that is it easy to include the genes responsible for nutrients in the new varieties by ordinary breeding or genetic engineering? So it's two questions. Is the taste in crop wild relatives and maybe opportunity crops or lesser known crops would probably be a better word for that than the normal cultivated ones? And is that the reason for the better taste that we find in those lesser known crops related to higher nutrients? And then the second one is how easy it is the difficulty in breeding or genetic engineering of those tastes and nutrients into cultivated varieties?
The crop wild relative question is really interesting because a lot of modern breeding, especially in more developed economies, has been getting rid of the taste of crop wild relatives because it's judged less attractive. And the classic example of this is the taste of the protective compounds in brassicas, cabbages. Land races, crop wild relatives of brassicas can be very bitter, can be very harsh from the glucosinolates, from the oh gosh, I've forgotten the name for the mustardy compounds. But anyway, those tastes have often been bred out. So those nutritionally important compounds have been bred out. As far as I'm aware, things like vitamins are essentially tasteless. And I think the same goes for minerals in the quantities that they would be expected. So I don't think that that's been an issue with crop wild relatives. Again, I'm not aware of anything, but I would be very surprised if that were important. As for the question of is it easy? No, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy either by conventional breeding or by direct genetic manipulation. And the main reason it's not easy is because the plant cell is a complex functioning whole. And when you introduce a new, whether you do it with a construct that you put in directly or whether you do it by crossbreeding, you can't guarantee what you're doing, not even with the new technologies, CRISPR and so on. You can't guarantee the outcome. And so a lot of the work of breeding is not so much breeding as it is selection. It's easy enough to make crosses, a little more difficult with crop wild relatives because you often have to go through an intermediate in order to get it into the developed adapted pool. Making the crosses is not that difficult. And you can generate 10,000 seeds, every one of which is different, quite easily. But you then have to find the needle in the haystack. And that's why people are using marker-assisted selection to find that needle as quickly as possible in the haystack of 100,000 seeds, 10,000 seeds. And that's great. But in order to use marker-assisted selection, you have to have a marker. And the marker brings with it genetic uniformity. So no, it's not easy. I wish I had a better answer.
Yeah. We have a couple more, 2-3 more questions. Why has the global agri-research community put so much more emphasis on biofortification than the alternatives then? Was and is biofortification used to justify spending on fancy state-of-the-art technologies rather than on addressing the real issues?
I think I sort of said biofortification seems to be a simple answer to a difficult problem. And if you go to somebody, especially somebody with money, and say, give me money and I will solve what seems to be a difficult problem, they're much more likely to give you the money than if you say to them, give me money and I will try lots of different things that might help solve it in some places, even if the money you're asking for is a lot less. It's very, very difficult to come up with a scalable, far-reaching, globally appropriate intervention to address micronutrient deficiencies. I'd say, I mean, I could say it was scalable and globally applicable if I just said focus on dietary diversity and do it in the way that's appropriate in each community. But I think that's the reason why it's been so attractive to grant-giving bodies. And yes, it enables you to do shiny science with new machines and not have to work with communities. And yeah, it's attractive for the wrong reasons. And
I'm
what
going to
was
skip.
there was the second part?
Yeah. No, I think that was it.
Okay.
Yes, that was it. I'm going to skip one and come back to it later because I think the last one that we have is very related to what you just said. Thank you for the clarity and insights. This is such a rich, complex topic needing so many other fields of study and interventions. For example, measuring the true cost of food, consumer education, distribution to improve vitamin loss, etc. You've spoken about what bad looks like. You've also hinted a bit on what studies are lacking to be more thorough. But what does good look like? What does it mean to meet communities or meeting communities at the scale they source diets? How else can we think differently about this issue?
What a beautiful question. Have you got
Yeah,
another
it is. It is.
one? How differently can we think about it? I think the way to do this might be in concert with what I would more broadly call social welfare. And I think that would be appropriate in countries, communities at any income level. Because I think one of the things I've hardly addressed is that hidden hunger is just as bad in developed countries as it is in developing countries. You know, governments, the US, the UK, much of Europe have been saying eat 5 portions of fruit and veg a day for as long as I can remember, and we're still not doing it. So I think it has to come at a grassroots level, which means, without going forward in a kind of barefoot doctor kind of way. I'd love to see social influencers talking about better nutrition. I'd love to see community activists making food available to the community, teaching communities about nutrition. I'd like to see midwives, doulas, wise women know more about nutrition. I'd like to see farmers connected directly to markets, local markets, so that they can share their surpluses. All of this sounds backwards almost, but I think what we have as a possibility is the internet and digital connectivity, not on a grand scale, but on a small scale. And so I'd love to see ways of having smaller communities somehow, and that's the sort of stage 2 to get onto stage 3, make profit. But I'd love to see smaller communities coalesce around some form of mutual self-help. I know that sounds awfully pie in the sky, but that's what I'd like to see. And I think that, let me just say, I think that's as important in the US, the UK, Europe, developed economies as it is anywhere else. Maybe the middle income countries are the ones where it's really difficult, because they're the ones that have got the full brunt of the industrial food supply system telling them to buy rubbish. I think really poor countries have not yet succumbed to that, and really rich countries, at least some people, have the luxury of not succumbing to that. But yeah, I think that's a real problem.
Thank you. And our last question has to do with agricultural biofortification versus genetic biofortification. So it says, do you think agricultural biofortification answers some of your concerns more than genetic biofortification does?
I just don't know, because there are some pretty good examples. Um, you can enhance selenium, zinc, iron with adding minerals to the soil. Where how does the poor farmer know what their soil needs? Where are the instant soil test kits that will tell me that not only do I need NPK, but I need a little smidgen of selenium as well? I don't know where those are. I don't even know whether the ones, where are the soil analysis kits that you can plug your phone into? Maybe they exist. So I think there's a possibility for it, but I'm not. And I just don't know how you make it work, how you give farmers access to the minerals they need. And of course, for vitamins, for micronutrients rather than minerals, there's no pathway that I'm aware of.
Okay. And I think with that, we would like to end the webinar. Many thanks to you, Jeremy Cherfas, for your thoughts on holistic alternatives based on diversified, nutrient-dense diets that can address hidden hunger. And also thank you to the attendees for tuning in and expanding your discussion with the questions. Jeremy, I'll hand it over to you for any last thoughts and goodbyes.
Let me just say thank you again, Yanni, and the Crop Trust for making this possible. Thank you to everybody who attended. And though this seems a little weird, thank you to anybody who watches all the way through on the recording that you've made. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.